Welcome back to Washington Journal. We're joined now by Representative Bruce Westerman. He's a Republican of Arkansas and chair of the Natural Resources Committee. Congressman, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Mimi. Good to be with you.
As I just said, you are the chair of the Natural Resources Committee. Can you talk about your priorities in this Congress and your goals?
Well, we've got a lot of work to do in this Congress, and if you look at the jurisdiction of the Natural Resources Committee, a lot of that is energy and minerals. So energy production and mining are going to be a huge part of the work that we do. But we also have jurisdiction over federal lands and forestry, over fisheries. We also have Indian and Insular Affairs. So we've got a full workload, not to mention California water and wildlife and fisheries. So lots of things will be on our plate. But we had a good run last Congress. We got a lot of bills passed and signed into law. We got the Explore Act, which is the country's first outdoor recreation bill, and this was a large bipartisan bill that was so popular it passed out of committee unanimously, it passed out of the House unanimously, and then it passed the Senate unanimously, and President Biden signed it into law. So we're excited about outdoor recreation and access to public lands and meeting the growing needs of our country.
You are the only licensed forester in Congress. I want to ask you about the wildfires in California, but what does that mean to be a licensed forester?
Well, I studied forestry in graduate school, and there's actually a licensing process, so you have to take an exam and do continuing education if you want to keep a license to practice forestry. I did engineering for my undergraduate work, and I'm a professional engineer, and I've been able to keep those licenses up to speed while I'm here in Congress. But it's kind of neat I think last Congress I was the only licensed professional engineer and the only forester in Congress. I don't know why they say licensed forester. I think I'm just quite simply the only person that studied forestry in Congress.
So can you talk about your views of the California wildfires and noting that President Trump has departed the White House and will be surveying damage there in California later today?
Well, these are obviously devastating. If anybody's paid any attention to the news, you know it's just heartbreaking to see over 15,000 homes destroyed, 28 lives lost, and at last count, I think it was $250 billion of estimated damage. And it's very tough conditions out there. I've spent time in Southern California. I was out there in October flying over what was called the airport fire. It didn't make near as much news because it didn't burn near as many homes, but you have these steep canyons with what are called forest, but it's really just chaparral and kind of scrubby oak trees and brush. It gets very dry, and you get these strong winds that come through, and when these fires start, they're almost impossible to put out. And you know, fire traveling uphill is it's when it burns the hottest. If you think of a match and you strike it and hold it straight up, the flame's not very big, but if you point that flame down where it's running up the matchstick, you know, it'll burn your finger pretty quickly, and that's kind of what happens when these fires are going up slope. But when you look at the whole situation, there are things that we can do. We know what happens when you get this dry fuel and wind and fires, and we got a lot of people living in what's called the wildland-urban interface, and it's where the forest meets the neighborhoods, and those are the areas we really need to focus on to prevent the loss of life and property. And the Fix Our Forest Act has provisions in it where we can create these defensible zones between the forest and the neighborhoods.
And Congressman, I do want to ask you about that Fix Our Forest bill, but going back to the wildfires, the mayor of Los Angeles and the governor of California have come under considerable criticism for their response to the wildfires. Do you think that criticism is appropriate?
Well, there's always going to be criticism of public officials when you have disasters like this. Some's appropriate and some's probably not. When you look at the type of fire that they had, sure, it started in the canyon. There's things that could have been done to mitigate these situations so the fires didn't get as bad. But once these fires got into the neighborhoods, we think of it as a wildfire, but it's really multiple house fires, and they're trying to fight these house fires with conventional firefighting equipment, and they just simply didn't have enough water or equipment or people there. And where does that blame fall? I guess it has to come back on the public officials, because it's their job to provide fire protection services and to make sure that those systems are up to speed and can handle whatever comes at them. When we think of the forest on fire, you think of tankers dropping water and dropping fire retardant and people parachuting out and fighting the fires. Well, you've got a combination of that going on, and I think instead of blaming everyone, we need to look at it and figure out what we can do better to prevent these disasters going forward.
And Congressman Westerman, do you believe that climate change is increasing the frequency of wildfires and the intensity of wildfires?
Well, that's a question that gets asked a lot, and we certainly see times when we have drier conditions, hotter conditions, but we also see that there are different places across the country that are experiencing the same conditions, and the intensity and number of fires are not increasing in these places. So regardless if it's climate change causing it or if it's weather conditions or poor management, we still have to ask the question, what are we going to do about it? And if we know that the climate's warming and that these conditions are going to get worse, the science of forestry tells us how to manage these lands so that we have the proper amount of vegetation on the land. And the big problem is we're getting these overstocked fuel loads, and when the fires happen, they're just catastrophic, and you can't put them out. They're so hot that they burn the organic matter out of the soil sometimes, and you can't even get trees to grow back. And it's an environmental travesty, because we know that the forest fires put more carbon in the atmosphere, but they also, when you denude the land like that and the rains come along, which they eventually will in California, we're going to see tremendous soil erosion and mudslides and water quality issues. So by keeping our forests healthy and intact, it adds all kinds of public safety features and environmental benefits.
And if you'd like to join our conversation with Congressman Bruce Westerman, you can do so on our lines by party. Democrats 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001, and Independents 202-748-8002. You can start calling in. He's a Republican of Arkansas. And Congressman, you were talking to us about the Fix Our Forests Act that passed the House. I'll put that up on the screen. Give us a little bit more information about what that does and what you expect to happen in the Senate.
Well, first off, Mimi, this is a very bipartisan bill. I worked on it with my colleague, Democrat Scott Peters from the San Diego area. Scott was an environmental lawyer, and he and I have been talking about forest health for several years now. We first wrote a bill called the Save Our Sequoias Act because we've lost 20% of the giant sequoias on the planet due to wildfire. And when you really look at the science of what's happened, it was because we've mismanaged those groves. But Scott and I worked together. We got a lot of Democrat co-sponsors and actually passed this bill out of the House last fall, but we couldn't get any movement in the Senate. And in light of these horrendous fires, we decided we can't stop. We got the bill back up and passed it out of the House yesterday with even more Democrat co-sponsors and more Democrat votes. So I think the House has spoken, and we need to get the Senate off dead center to take this bill up and pass it as soon as possible so that President Trump can sign it and so that we can start doing the work. It's going to take decades to get these areas back where they need to be. And we've seen the loss of 15,000 homes, but if you look across the country, there are 44 million homes in the same condition in this wildland-urban interface where these catastrophic wildfires can break out. So there's a ton of work to do. We should have been doing this decades ago, but we need to get this bill passed so it can happen sooner.
Switching over to energy, Congressman, President Trump has declared a national energy emergency, and he's expected to roll back regulations, promote more leasing on federal lands for drilling. What do you think is the practical impact here of those actions?
Well, we need more energy is the practical impact, and we need reliable and affordable energy, and we need the cleanest energy possible. And the U.S. is really good at producing clean, affordable, and reliable energy. If you just look at the numbers, we're seeing a growth in electrical consumption by about 3 times per year. It used to be a 0.5% per year growth, and now it's at 1.5%. It's projected to grow even more, and that electricity has to come from somewhere. And there's been a lot of wind and solar built, but there's no way wind and solar can meet the growing demands of our country. So I think the president's looking at an all of the above energy approach, and I'm all for that. We've got a whole other issue with AI and data centers and the race on getting to the ASI, the superintelligence. We're in a race with China on that, and China's not holding back on energy development. They built 40 gigawatts of coal-powered plants just last year. To put that in perspective, that's a big coal-fired plant every week, and they're not even turning some of them on. I believe they're building these plants so that they can have the energy available when they get to the next iteration of AI.
Congressman, you mentioned that we need more energy, and I want to read to you a quote from the Natural Resources Defense Council's attorney who says, quote, "There is a bit of a hypocrisy in declaring a domestic energy emergency while we flood international markets with fossil fuels. We're the world's #1 exporter of oil and gas, and we have an energy emergency? What is this based on?" What's your reaction to that, sir?
Well, I think that's a short-sighted comment that's put out there to probably get some clickbait on their website, but that's not looking at the whole energy picture. I talked about the growing demand for electricity. We're shutting coal plants down here, and we need to be creating more baseload energy. I'm all for clean energy, but we can't build nuclear power plants here. We can't. It takes forever to get permits to build facilities. And also, we need to be exporting more energy because our allies around the world want it. And when we're not exporting energy, that demand's being filled by countries like Russia and Iran and others that are not our friends. And if you look at the 2 wars going on in Ukraine and with Hamas and Israel, Russia's funding their side of the war in Ukraine off of energy receipts, and Iran's funding these terrorist organizations off of energy receipts. So it's not only just energy security and energy dominance, but it's also national security when you look at the global energy picture. And the demand for energy globally is going up exponentially.
And you mentioned the competition with China. I want to ask about electric vehicles. Do you support the president's proposal to end the EV mandate and also the EV tax rebate for those that buy EVs that are manufactured in this country?
Absolutely. And if you look at the science on that, if we could convert every internal combustion engine in the United States to an EV overnight, it would have less than a 1% impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And I like EVs. They're fun to drive. It's great technology, but the technology should stand on its own. We shouldn't be picking winners and losers and putting this false idea that it's going to save the world if everybody drives an EV when the numbers simply don't add up. The U.S. produces about 13% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, but only 27% of that comes from all of transportation, and then 57% of that comes from light-duty trucks and passenger vehicles. So you do the math and you're down to around 2% of the global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from U.S. light-duty trucks and passenger vehicles. And then you find out that about 40% of our electricity comes from non-greenhouse gas emitting sources. So again, if you could make every car an EV overnight, you've only decreased global greenhouse gas emissions less than 1%. And it's a huge cost and inconvenience that's being put on the American consumer, claiming to have these great climate benefits when really it doesn't. And that 1% doesn't include the embedded carbon that it takes to do all the mining and build the components that go into an EV. And again, I'm all for EV technology. Just let it stand on its own. and don't require government mandate or government subsidy to make it work.